So, resuming our program this morning, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, and it's Senior Manager for Industrial Cybersecurity at Siemens. And again, welcoming back, Eitan Goldstein. Now, he's going to be speaking on a subject of ICS best practices and learnings from the field. Over to you, Eitan.
Thank you so much. So first, thanks everyone for having me here, and then a special thanks to Equate for putting this on. I go to a lot of these conferences, but this one's been especially impressive. So again, thanks all. Christy, you've been super helpful. I wanted to also just quickly introduce myself. I work on Siemens, it's not up there yet, I work on Siemens' Industrial Global Cyber Strategy team. So what that means I do is I help our customers secure their entire operating environment, and I help Siemens serve as a partner to that end. What we do is we help them mature the processes, the technologies, and their organization to help harden the OT environment. I'm going to talk about three things with you today. First, I want to talk about Siemens' view of the connection between digitalization and security. Secondly, I want to give my perspective on where I see most oil and gas customers today in terms of standing up their OT security programs. Lastly, and this is where I want to spend the most time, I want to give you a sense of what I see that's actually working in the field, what's not working in the field, right? What am I hearing from our customers? Because you see some of the same challenges and pain points around the world. To give you a sense of who I'm talking to today, I cover oil and gas customers on 4 different continents, upstream to downstream. I work with IOCs, I work with NOCs. I see some companies that are just figuring out the OT space. I see some companies that are incredibly sophisticated, and we can learn from them when we go in there. So let me quickly walk you through that. But again, I want to spend the bulk of our time today talking about what I'm actually seeing in the field. Right, so I think the first message I want to drive home is there's a tremendous opportunity for digitalization in oil and gas. Relative to other verticals, oil and gas is behind, and there is tremendous upside to be captured, right? And so when we go and talk to our customers about the digital oil field, we talk about things like predictive analytics, predictive maintenance. We talk about things like cloud applications and trying to capture all the benefits that you're talking about here. So we see a massive opportunity around digitalization. And we see security as the key enabler for cybersecurity, or for digitalization. The thing I always hear from our customers, right, is we want to do all these great things, right? So we want to be able to capture the benefits of digitalization, but we know we have to get security right. And so there's tremendous concern about what comes with that. Let me talk now about how I see our customers looking at the problem, right? So if you look at the slide over here, over the last 4 years, cybersecurity has increased as a concern for CEOs by 500%, right? Everyone knows the risk. It's not a secret anymore. It is a board-level concern. Oil and gas is different, too, because it faces a wider range and more severe impacts than essentially any other sector. Right, so what this slide simply shows is that we're seeing more risks in oil and gas with greater impact. I saw Michael Hayden testify last year. Michael Hayden's the former head of the NSA, and he said that he thought that up to 50% of all cyber attacks were going after the energy sector today. So we see a unique risk to this space with an incredibly high impact. Our customers get this. This is not a secret. Right? Now, the challenge is, on the OT side, a lot of them are not entirely prepared to meet the risk, right? So I think what I hear increasingly when I talk to customers, and we've got some cool data on this from the US, is there is a view that there is greater risk on the OT side than on the IT side in 2017. So the risk has migrated, right? And so there's a couple core challenges, right? So first, our customers lack visibility into their OT network. They don't know what's on there. Sometimes they don't know what's not on there, right? So that lack of transparency is a recurring challenge. Another recurring challenge that we're going to talk a little bit about today is a lack of in-house talent for OT security, right? So they have a ton of trouble finding and then retaining OT security talent, particularly in oil and gas, where there is a view that the digital natives, as that generation is called, aren't necessarily welcome. Right, so here's some broad data that talks about where we see our customers today. So most of our customers have started, right? They've started to launch their OT security program. That means they have the policies in place. That usually means they've got 1 or 2 dedicated people to getting this stuff right. Now the challenge here is around implementation, right? It's very easy to cut and paste from NIST and say, here's our policies, this is what we're doing on access management, this is what we're doing on remote connectivity. The challenge here is around execution. So when we go and talk to our customers, the recurring thing I hear is, okay, I know what I need to do, I'm actually having trouble getting it done. Let's look a little more closely at what some of those challenges are. Right, so we know that there is a mix of legacy equipment, right? We're generally hardening brownfield, right? So, and these are things that were designed without security in mind. We know that some of these assets simply cannot be patched anymore, so what do? How do you segment? What are the zones that you want them in, right? And we know that, frankly, there's some really serious problems at the heart of this, right? Which is an expanding attack surface, a multi-vendor system of systems where they're trying to secure this legacy and digital asset mix. And then there's a huge problem around supply chain visibility and control. All right, so this is where our customers are today. I think we spent a lot of time talking about what the OT environment looks like this week. So what I want to get into then is this slide right here. Let's talk about what we see working and what we maybe think doesn't quite work, right? And there's a couple areas where I think it'd be valuable to spend time because I see them as really high impact, right? And we can break it down into people, processes, and technologies, right? So one of the processes that I spend a lot of time talking with my customers about is around incident response, right? Because their view, and frankly our view, is that a breach is almost a mathematical certainty at this point. Right? And so one of the things that we know is that if you have a plan in place, that will reduce the impact of it. So what are the things that you can actually do to make sure that plan works? Because a lot of people have a plan on the shelf, right? But then it just sits there. So we'll work with our customers to rigorously test that plan. Let's look at what happens in the event of an incident under the worst possible circumstances. So the worst circumstances are the evening right before the weekend. It's a Thursday night before a holiday. Everyone goes home. I can't find the CISO, and it's going after the crown jewels, right? So let's see what would happen. Let's maybe work with a vendor to use an asset offline and do a tabletop exercise and see how that might work. Because again, the thing with incident response plans is it's really nice to have the plan, but they've got to be pressure tested, they've got to be validated, and your people have to know how to actually implement them. Another processes that I think is something that we hear a lot is how do we get the IT and the OT organizations to play together? And frankly, that's a theme we've heard all week, right? I was with a downstream customer last week, and they wanted to do a gap analysis. They said, hey, Siemens, help us do a gap analysis. Our challenge is IT won't let you come in here because they view that as their terrain, right? So the stakeholder we have to persuade is my IT counterpart, right? And so sometimes we're being asked by the OT guys to go make the case for OT security measures with the IT team, right? And so we've heard about different ways you can do that. There's no one-size-fits-all answers. So I've seen steering committees. I've seen organizations where they'll second someone from IT to OT, or someone from OT to IT, maybe for the duration of a project, maybe for 6 months. And what that does is that gets people working together. It gets people understanding the culture. And it shows that they're not necessarily rivals, right? Because I think a lot of the times there's just simply a culture clash. Another area where I talk about almost in every meeting with my customers is around how to build a culture of security awareness. So every organization has security training programs. The problem is almost every organization is not happy with how they work. And so we hear a couple things almost across the industry. So one, I have a lot of trouble getting this down to the plant or facility level, right? So it's nice as a corporate exercise, but how do I make sure that my guys don't charge their iPhone on the DCS or download a video game onto the HMI, right? It's translating that at the plant level. And we Siemens think that there's a couple different ways you can do that. We like an approach that's a very tailored train-the-trainer approach. So we'll spend time with the plant manager, right? We'll spend a day or so with him and kind of pass along those trainings, and he'll end up doing it. The idea here is that when he goes and talks to the plant, he's a known quantity, he doesn't look like me, and he speaks their language. He gets the operating environment, and he's able to land those messages. The other thing we see that works really, really well as we think about building that security culture are things like tailored trainings. So I've seen an organization that will do trainings around a very specific threat. So they had a spearfishing lunch and learn, right? So let's come in and let's talk about this one threat. And what they're essentially saying is we're going to align our training programs with what we see are the greatest threats today. And it's an example, too, of how you can make the training programs not just sort of a formality, right? I click through, I get an email saying that I've done it. We see a lot of people who tell us that I'm not sure that people are actually engaging. And if they don't engage, they get a mean email from the boss, right? So how can I make sure that people know that we take this really seriously? Well, there's a couple things we can do. I'd say first, senior leadership has to show that this is a top priority for them. So I've seen trainings where the VP of operations and EVP will come and sit down in that training to show that this is a deadly serious matter to the company and that he expects his people to follow it, right? But it's got to be a real clear message from the top down that the leadership cares. Otherwise, people are going to do it over their lunch, they're not going to pay attention, and it won't really land. It won't change the culture. It's something that I think is a huge challenge. I think the other challenge we find is a lot of organizations are just pulling trainings off the rack, right? They're not customizing it to their particular operating environment, to the vertical, to where are you midstream, are you upstream? And when you don't do that, people don't take it seriously. So there's got to be a really thoughtful, tailored approach. Another area where I get lots of questions, and as we think here about the broader context of digitalization and the benefits of connectivity, are around secure remote access. I would say all of my customers are terrified of connectivity. Almost all of them will say, we will not allow secure remote access in the meetings. After the meetings, they'll say, we know connectivity is coming. We know we need to figure out how to do secure remote access to gain some of these benefits, right? Is that the maintenance? Is that the vendor support? Is that the predictive analytics? You've got to be able to connect. They're not ready yet. So what they come to us and they say is, we need a strategy and a solution for connectivity. We know it may not be next month, but we need a plan for next year. So understanding how that will work is something that we see over and over. If we shift over to the technology or the solutions that I see on a recurring basis, I'd say one of the core challenges, and indeed maybe the biggest pain point I see, is around visibility into your network, right? So how do I know what I need to protect? And figuring out what's on your network and maybe what's not on your network is a really, really big challenge. I've been to plants where people will walk around with an Excel spreadsheet trying to do it. That's not a very sophisticated approach. That's not a scalable approach. So how can you automate asset management? How can you then use that to do things like configuration management and patch management? How do you move from ad hoc solutions? Like, for example, I've seen a customer on port security walks around with a glue gun, right? These are not scalable things. So our customers are looking to move from ad hoc solutions to scalable automated solutions. We see that in particular here around network security monitoring, right? So when I talk to my big oil and gas customers, the name of the game is improving detection and response, right? They know that a simple perimeter defense will not cut it, and they know that what they're doing is probably not up to snuff, right? So they've moved on from that first line of defense where they're putting in firewalls, they're securing access management, and now they're starting to think about what do we do when someone gets through. Here the challenge is, well, gosh, we probably don't have the people who have the skills to do this, or we're not entirely comfortable outsourcing this to a SOC. So the challenge is how do you bring that talent in-house? Again, I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things I hear everywhere is it's incredibly difficult to find OT cyber talent, and we get them and then they leave. How do we retain them? One of the things that we've done with our customers that we see is really effective is we'll take a process engineer or an automation engineer, and we'll essentially cyberize them. We actually find it easier to teach the cyber piece to an automation engineer than to teach a cybersecurity expert, maybe from the IT side, the OT environment. So it's thinking about how do you upskill people to tackle some of these talent shortages. Another thing that we're doing with some of our customers that I think is really effective is we're actually starting to partner with universities to develop OT-specific cyber curriculums, right? So let's go to an engineering school in Texas if we, Siemens, need a certain kind of talent. Let's work with that engineering school about developing a specific curriculum, right? So let's be forward thinking about how we get the people we need. We're doing on time, just wanted to make sure, great. One of the other things that I think it might be useful just to talk about briefly is the idea of how do you handle insider threat? So the data will show that most breaches today are the result of insider threat. We also know that most of those are inadvertent, right? So they are someone just being sloppy or thoughtless, like I said, plugging in their iPhone where they shouldn't. So what can you do about that? We see a lot of our customers starting to look at things like user behavioral analytics to look for patterns that don't make sense, right? So how can you start to catch these mistakes where you don't have to rely on people, right? Because you can have the best training program in the world, the people still get sloppy. Now, the challenge is when I look at what our customers are buying today versus what we think works, we see a sort of a mismatch of a lot of investments still in some of those perimeter defense things, right? I'm investing in how do I harden my endpoints, right? How do I secure the network? And at the same time, we're not seeing as much of an investment we like around analytics. And I think right now that's a function of a talent shortage. And I think that's the sense that there's a little bit of concern that they just don't know it and they don't know how to best do it. So our customers are starting to look at some managed service operations, but I think it's still a little bit daunting for them. So that's kind of a high-level view of what I'm seeing. I would note the one recurring thing we hear is that they need more support from the private sector, right? Like, I see customers who often the first thing I say when I walk into their office is, "It's about time you guys are here," right? And so they're looking for support. They're looking for insights, and they're looking for people to partner with them to mature their OT programs. I think that's what we're trying to do at Siemens, and I think we've had some success. So I have a couple minutes left, and I just wanted to make sure I left some time for questions. And I will open it up now, should any have any, though I cannot really see out into the audience. Right down here.
It's great to hear that you're sharing best practices of the oil and gas sector for cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm.
So if I may ask one question, if I may have to start somewhere, what would you suggest as the right point to start in the oil and gas industry, especially in the Middle East, which is under high threat over the past few months at least?
Yeah, so I think for me, the place I always want to start is around asset management solutions, right? Which is the idea that you need to know what's on your network, you need to know what you need to protect, and you need to get that baseline before you can start to build out your OT structure with all the cool tools, before you can do things like anomaly detection. So it's how do we get that foundational visibility into the network? That's where I would start.
One more question, if you allow me. Some customers feel that I'm shy to talk about an attack in my organization.
Yeah.
Is it something which you see common?
Yeah, so
is it culture-based or is it something
there's
very
absolutely a huge reluctance to talk about this. What I hear from my customers all the time is that information sharing is incredibly valuable and effective, right? So you've got like the ONG ISAC in the US, which is a forum that allows oil and gas companies to anonymously share threat information. They all say it's great. Very few of them actually actively participate. And they don't for a couple reasons. One, there's not management buy-in. There's a lot of concern about legal liability, even though it shouldn't attach. And then there's just generally a concern about sharing this sort of information, right? So it's something we heard earlier in this conference is we need better sharing, but there is real reluctance to move forward with it. Sorry, go ahead.
My name is Khalid Alayan. I'm from KJOC, Kuwait Gulf Oil Company. I'd like to hear from your point of view if there is any plans that you can provide for business continuity and disaster recovery plans from your perspective, please.
Yeah, so what I would say is when we think about disaster recovery and business continuity, earlier I was talking about incident response. One of the core challenges we have with incident response is getting the business continuity and the cyber people working together. Right, so there's got to be all sorts of fallback plans. One of the challenges you see in the OT world is sometimes the backups will fail too, right? You know, so you saw this in the Ukraine where they had a little bit of trouble getting back up and running because there's not a virtualized backup, right? And there is some reluctance in the ICS world to go to virtualized backups. I think we'll head in that direction, but right now it's a huge challenge. And sometimes the sort of failover approach, well, if this one fails, we've got the backup, may not necessarily work. They could be connected, and they could both be down. So it's a huge challenge.
Eitan, I think that is our questions finished. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for our speaker, Eitan Goldstein.
Thank you.